Darren, it's been 12 years since you won the championship of public speaking. Since that time, what have you learned about giving presentations?
I learned the value of coaching when I first met Mark Brown, who was my coach. Mark was the 1995 world champion of public speaking, and Mark, you know, even though I'd been a Toastmaster for 7 years, Mark showed me a whole different level of speaking that I didn't know existed. I just thought, well, you know, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them, you know, and that's not enough. And when I don't know if you remember this story, but when I had my first session with Mark Brown, my coach, which I had never been coached before David McElhaney, rest his soul, and Mark Brown that year. They were my coaches, and I didn't know what a coach was. I thought, well, if they could give me a couple little tweaks, that would be great. But when I first met Mark Brown, I drove 2.5 hours to Reader's Digest, where he worked in New York from here in Boston. And I remember I was so excited, and he gave me a process to follow, and I wrote the greatest speech that I could ever write. It was awesome. And I remember as Mark stood in front of me and I handed him the first version of the speech, there was choirs of angels. Oh! And I handed Mark the speech. Mark took the speech, and as you know, Mark's Jamaican, has a heart of gold, stands about 6'2", and he looked at the speech. Oh, Darren, we have some work to do. What? I did everything you told me to do. But you see, the value of a good communication, the value of a good presentation is perspective. And what Mark could see in 2 minutes, what I couldn't see after 7 years as a Toastmaster and a presenter and a stand-up, he could see it instantly. But I couldn't see it because he had a much higher level of perspective. And when our goal is to communicate, you know, you, because you've been doing, you know, this show for 18 months, you could teach people how to interview. Why? Because you've done it. You've been in the trenches. You have a higher level of perspective as an interviewer than someone who's never done it before. And so I learned the value of the speech is perspective. For me, the value of coaching, being willing to be open and tell you know, trust someone who's ahead of you in their career how to get your point across better. One of the key techniques that I learned from Mark Brown that I coach other people. You know, I'm doing a presentation at lunch today in Wellesley, and then tonight how to write a speech or workshop in Natick. And one of the key things that I've learned since winning is the power of dialogue. I learned from Bill Gove, one of the greatest speaker coaches in the world, that all speaking is tell a story, make a point, tell another story, make another point, tell another story, make another point, which is great. But my first version of the speech before I worked with Mark, I told or narrated a story of when I went home to tell my parents I wanted to be a comedian. And I told them how it was back then. But what Mark taught me was to take that story from narration from the past and turn it into dialogue. One of the #1 tips that any presenter, even a corporate presenter, needs to understand is your stories told in dialogue are much more powerful. And what I mean by that is we hear the characters talking. So, for example, in that situation, it's a quick 17-second story in my speech. Originally, before I worked with Mark, it was, so I went home to tell my parents I wanted to be a comedian, and they were speechless. Ugh, that's boring. But what Mark got me to do is turn it into dialogue. So I changed it into, so I went home to tell my parents, Mom, Dad, I want to be a comedian. I was met by silence. See, what Mark taught me to do was to take people to the moment so they can hear the conversation. And then the other quick, powerful tip is that most presenters are so quick to get to their next words that they don't allow the reaction. A lot of that quick story is told when I'm not saying anything, when I'm reacting to my parents' non-reaction. So a lot's going on there. There's 3 characters in the story. 2 of them don't even talk. But because of my facial expression and showing the reaction, It makes it a much more powerful story. It brings the audience in. So number one tip, tell your stories in dialogue versus narration. And number two, allow the reactions. Don't be so quick to get to the next words. Allow us to see the reaction. I mean, if you think of movies, TV commercials, the reaction shot is so important, but speakers often forget that.
Stage time.